On a crisp morning in downtown Atlanta, Harriet Mansfield, a 50-year-old woman with a penchant for predictability, stepped out of her pearl-white Lexus, her heart fluttering with a mix of pride and unease. She had lived her entire life cocooned in the orderly elegance of Buckhead, a wealthy enclave where manicured lawns and Victorian homes painted a picture of serene perfection. Each day unfolded with mechanical precision, rising at 6:15 a.m., slipping on her sensible loafers to walk her dogs, Doc and Tucker, and savoring a single slice of toast slathered with strawberry jam, a ritual so ingrained it felt like a sacred pact with the universe. Harriet thrived on this sameness, finding solace in rules and routines that shielded her from the unpredictability she quietly despised. Yet beneath her polished exterior simmered a belief she rarely voiced aloud. Some people simply didn't belong, and it was her unspoken duty to keep them at bay. It was a conviction rooted in the stern warnings of her father, a retired police officer who drilled into her teenage mind the need for vigilance in a world teeming with others of vague, ominous categories she'd since painted with broad, suspicious strokes. That morning, though, Harriet had dared to stray from her well-trodden path. Her nephew, a lanky college kid with an infectious grin, had raved about a new Starbucks on Peachtree Street, insisting she try their salted caramel mocha concoction that sounded decadently foreign to her toast and jam palate. Intrigued, she'd navigated the bustling traffic, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as the familiar quiet of Buckhead gave way to the chaotic pulse of the city. Parking in a crowded lot, she stepped onto the sidewalk, her senses assaulted by the swirl of humanity. Tourists snapping photos of gleaming skyscrapers, students from Georgia State weaving through the throng with laughter spilling from their lips, and professionals in crisp suits striding purposefully past. Harriet adjusted her sunglasses, clutching her handbag like a lifeline as strangers brushed too close, their voices a jarring symphony she couldn't tune out. The sight of the Starbucks logo a green beacon of familiarity eased the knot in her chest. Here, at least, she knew the script, a line, a menu, a polite barista. She could handle that. Inside, the air buzzed with the whir of espresso machines and the rich scent of roasted beans, a comforting balm to her rattled nerves. Harriet joined the queue, her eyes scanning the chalkboard menu for the drink her nephew had championed. She rehearsed the order in her mind, a small thrill of adventure tingling through her until her gaze landed on the woman ahead of her. Tall and poised, the stranger exuded an effortless confidence that made Harriet's stomach twist. Dressed in a navy blazer that hugged her frame just so, paired with crisp black slacks and sleek heels, the woman stood with a quiet authority. Her hair, twisted neatly at the nape of her neck, gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and she juggled a phone and notepad with the ease of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. Harriet's breath caught as she watched her, an inexplicable unease creeping up her spine. Why was she so focused on that phone? What was she writing? The woman's calm demeanor felt like a challenge, a silent affront to Harriet's fragile sense of control. Then, a soft voice broke her spiraling thoughts. "Excuse me," the woman said, stepping aside with a polite nod, offering Harriet space to move if she wished. Startled, Harriet blinked, muttering a curt sorry as heat crept up her neck. She shuffled back into place, but the encounter left her rattled, a drumbeat of distrust pounding in her chest. She didn't know why this stranger unsettled her so deeply, only that she did. And in that moment, Harriet's ingrained instincts kicked in, the ones her father had nurtured all those years ago. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed 911, her voice low but firm as she reported a suspicious person in the coffee shop. It was a snap decision, born of a prejudice so woven into her being she didn't even recognize it for what it was. She told herself she was being cautious, protecting her space in a world that felt increasingly foreign. But as she hung up, a flicker of doubt gnawed at her, a whisper she quickly silenced. Unbeknownst to Harriet, the woman she'd just targeted was no ordinary bystander. Jasmine Owens, a seasoned CIA operative, stood mere feet away, her mind a fortress of focus amid a covert mission that had brought her to Atlanta. From her base in Langley, Virginia, at 38, Jasmine carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd fought to carve her place in a world that often tried to box her in. Raised in a modest Chicago neighborhood, she'd grown up under the watchful eyes of her Princepath teachers who'd poured lessons of justice and humility into her soul. A star student at Loyola University Chicago, she'd graduated with honors in political science, her future shimmering with possibilities. Law school beckoned, but Jasmine craved something bigger, a calling that matched her fierce resolve to protect the vulnerable and dismantle the threats lurking in society's shadows. The CIA had become her home, a realm where her analytical brilliance and steely composure propelled her through the ranks, despite the sidelong glances she sometimes caught from colleagues, mostly white men, from privileged networks who underestimated her at their peril. Now, in Atlanta, Jasmine was deep into a high-stakes operation, tracking an international narcotics syndicate suspected of laundering money through local businesses. Posing as a financial consultant for a fictitious firm, Hastings and Brooks, she blended seamlessly into the city's rhythm, her navy blazer and pressed slacks a perfect disguise. Tucked beneath her professional veneer was a concealed sidearm standard issue for emergencies, and a phone loaded with encrypted software that kept her tethered to her superiors. That morning, she'd risen early in her hotel room, poring over mission details with the meticulous care that defined her. She hated rushing, preferring to stride into any situation with her wits sharp and her surroundings mapped in her mind. The Starbucks on Peachtree Street was her rendezvous point, a bustling hub where she could meet a contact unnoticed amid the crowd. As she stepped inside, she noted the short line with a flicker of satisfaction, time enough to order a coffee and check her encrypted messages. Jasmine's fingers danced across her phone, confirming her contact's ETA, while she scribbled innocuous notes in her pad to maintain her cover. Her training had honed her awareness to a razor's edge, and she clocked the woman behind her almost instantly, a middle-aged white lady, tense as a coiled spring, her eyes darting with barely concealed agitation. Jasmine cataloged her in a mental file, nervous, out of her element, possibly harmless. She offered a polite "excuse me" when their space overlapped, a small gesture to ease the woman's obvious discomfort. But when she caught the faint murmur of a 911 call moments later, her instincts flared. She didn't turn, didn't react. Years in the field had taught her to stay cool under scrutiny, but she knew this wasn't just a coffee run anymore. Minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the hum of the coffee shop. Two officers strode in, their presence commanding attention as customers shifted uneasily. Harriet pointed a shaky finger at Jasmine, her voice tight with conviction. "That's her. She's acting suspicious, watching everyone, writing things down." The officers approached Jasmine, their hands resting lightly on their holsters, but her response was swift and unshaken. With a calm that belied the storm brewing around her, she produced her credentials, a badge gleaming under the lights, and spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. "I'm on assignment. This is a misunderstanding." The officers hesitated, exchanging glances as the weight of her authority sank in. Harriet's face drained of color, her certainty crumbling like dry sand. What followed was a whirlwind that Harriet could never have foreseen. Jasmine's mission wasn't derailed. If anything, the incident sharpened her resolve. She completed her rendezvous, passing intel that would later dismantle a multi-million-dollar laundering ring. But for Harriet, the consequences unfurled like a nightmare. Word of her baseless call spread, whispers rippling through her tight-knit Buckhead circle. Her country club friends, once quick with mimosas and gossip, grew distant, their smiles turning brittle. Then came the Sumansa lawsuit for defamation and emotional distress, filed by Jasmine's legal team with the precision of a surgical strike. In court, Harriet sat rigid, her hands twisting in her lap as Jasmine took the stand, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "I've spent my life serving this country," she said, her eyes locking briefly with Harriet's, "and in 10 seconds, she reduced me to a threat because of how I look." The judge's gavel fell like a thunderclap, ordering Harriet to pay damages that drained her savings and tarnished her name beyond repair. Her neighbors in Buckhead whispered behind closed doors, and her beloved routine dogs, Toast and Al, felt hollow, a fragile shell cracked by her own hand. Justice had spoken, not with vengeance, but with a clarity that laid bare the cost of her actions. For Jasmine, it was a bitter footnote to a career built on resilience. a reminder of the battles she fought beyond the mission. And for Harriet, it was a reckoning lesson etched in the ruins of her pride that power misused, even in a fleeting phone call, could unravel a life, leaving only regret in its wake. The Starbucks on Peachtree Street hummed with the restless energy of a Saturday morning. Jasmine stood in line, her senses sharp despite the casual air she projected. She couldn't help but notice the woman ahead of her, Harriet. As she'd later learn, every movement seemed laced with unease. Harriet's bob haircut framed her face in a rigid, almost sculptural way, each strand falling with military precision. Her pastel blouse, though neatly pressed, seemed to strain against her stiff shoulders, as if she were holding herself together by sheer will. Jasmine's instincts prickled. She didn't like jumping to hasty judgments, but something about Harriet's barely contained tension set her on edge. Was this just the jittery nerves of someone unaccustomed to the city's bustle? Or was there more beneath the surface? Jasmine dismissed the fleeting thought that Harriet might be tied to her assignment. No, she reasoned, this older woman was probably just out of her element, overwhelmed by the clamor of baristas calling orders and the impatient shuffle of caffeine-deprived customers. Still, Jasmine stayed mindful. She adjusted her stance, giving Harriet a wide berth as the line crept forward. The last thing she wanted was to crowd her and amplify that nervous energy. When she caught Harriet's fleeting glance seas wide, almost Corneredge's mind stepped aside with deliberate courtesy, offering a small nod as if to say, "Take your space." She kept her own demeanor neutral, her phone tilted just so, ensuring the screen's glow didn't betray the specialized app she was using. This wasn't the place for anyone to glimpse her true purpose. She was here for coffee, yes, but also to kill time before a critical meeting and informant rendezvous at a co-working space 3 blocks away, set for 10:30 a.m. Her contact's message had been brief but clear: be there. She'd grab her Pike Place roast, finalize her mental notes, and stroll over with minutes to spare. Harriet, though, was a puzzle Jasmine couldn't quite shake. The woman's reaction to her presence was almost theatrical. When Jasmine shifted to let her breathe, Harriet muttered a quick apology, her voice tight, before flicking her gaze away as if Jasmine's very existence unnerved her. Jasmine forced a polite smile, chalking it up to a bad morning. People in coffee lines were often frayed too little sleep, too much on their minds. She refocused on her phone, scrolling through the app's encrypted updates, her thoughts drifting to the informant and the money laundering case. She'd been unraveling for weeks, yet Harriet's rigid posture lingered in her peripheral vision, arms hugged close to her body, shoulders squared like someone bracing for a fight. It was a stance Jasmine knew well from years in the field, one she'd seen in people who distrusted her without cause, who saw threat where there was none. Stay calm, she told herself. Don't read too much into it. She could just be stressed about something else, work, family, anything. The line inched along, and Jasmine reached the counter. Tall Pike Place, black, no sugar, she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the alertness humming beneath her skin. She stepped aside, waiting near the pickup counter while Harriet hesitated, her eyes darting over the menu boards as if they were written in code. Finally, she ordered a salted caramel maca, something her nephew had apparently raved above, their tone clipped. Almost reluctant, Jasmine kept her distance, sensing Harriet's unease growing like a storm cloud. From the corner of her eye, she caught Harriet's stealing glances, her suspicion sharpening with every furtive peek. To Harriet, Jasmine's quiet confidence in her crisp navy blazer, her upright posture wasn't just poised. It was poised, polished for a random office worker. Harriet's mind spun a web of doubt. Was she typing so secretly? She wondered, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. Is she scoping the place out, planning something? That blazer wasn't casual Friday attire, it had the crisp edges of authority, maybe even a hint of the military. Harriet's imagination raced, unchecked and wild. Inside Harriet's head, a tempest brewed. She'd grown up on her father's tales-gruff warnings about trusting your gut when something felt off. If you see trouble, don't wait for it to find you, he'd said, his voice roughened by years of hard-earned lessons. Now, as she retreated to a small table by the window, that advice roared back to life. She fumbled with her phony and outdated model, its cracked screen protector a testament to neglect, and scrolled through social media, but the posts blurred into nonsense. Her eyes kept snapping to Jasmine, who stood calmly by the pickup counter, thumb gliding over her phone with maddening ease. Harriet's pulse quickened. Something's wrong, she told herself, her breath shallow. Then she saw a fleeting glance between Jasmine and a man in a rumpled suit, a local real estate agent waiting for his cappuccino. To anyone else, it was nothing, a meaningless flicker of eye contact in a crowded room. But to Harriet, it was a signal, a conspiratorial thread tying them together. They're on it, she thought, her heart thudding against her ribs. A robbery, a scam, worse. By the time her salted caramel mocha arrived, Harriet's palms were slick with sweat. She snatched the cup, took a single sip, the sweetness lost on her tongue, when set it down with a trembling hand. She rifled through her purse, brushing past a crumpled contact list, her fingers hovering over her phone. Her father's words pounded in her skull. Act on it. She tapped 911, her voice a hushed rasp as the operator picked up. Yes. I need to report someone suspicious at the Starbucks on Peachtree Street. She's acting strange, whispering on her phone, looking around like she's up to something. I think she might be dangerous. The operator's calm questions steadied her just enough to rattle off a description. Tall, African-American woman, mid-30s, navy blazer, black slacks. She's been staring at people, typing a lot. She feels threatening. Harriet's conviction hardened with every word, her paranoia cloaking itself as truth. When the call ended, a rush of adrenaline surged through her, clammy and electric. She was sure she'd just thwarted a crime, protected the innocent souls around her. Justice, she thought, tasted like this: bitter, urgent, righteous. Across the room, Jasmine collected her coffee, oblivious to the drama unfolding in Harriet's mind. She flashed a warm smile at the barista, who'd chirped, "Love your shoes," and turned toward the exit, her thoughts already on the meeting ahead. Harriet, though, sprang up, nearly toppling her mocha in her haste. She couldn't let Jasmine vanish, not before the police arrived. Grabbing her purse, she abandoned her drink and trailed Jasmine outside, her attempt at nonchalance crumbling into a frantic shuffle. Jasmine stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, the city's pulse swallowing her up, while Harriet pressed herself against the Starbucks exterior wall, eyes locked on her target. Her phone was out again, her voice breathless as she dialed 911 a second time. "She's leaving, no, headed south on Peachtree. Please hurry." The operator's reassurance fikers are en route, sent a shiver of dread and triumph through her. She was no bystander, she was a guardian, a sentinel of order in a chaotic world. Jasmine walked on, checking her phone 20 minutes until the meeting. She rehearsed her opening lines, piecing together how she'd extract the last scraps of intel to crack the laundering scheme wide open. The swirl of pedestrians and distant horns barely registered. Then came the sirens, sharp and insistent, slicing through the morning air. She paused, curiosity tugging at her, and turned just as two patrol cars screeched to a halt along the curb. Officers spilled out, hands poised near their holsters, scanning the crowd with practiced intensity. From her perch by the window, Harriet waved frantically, pointing at Jasmine like a hunter marking prey. Jasmine's brow creased, confusion tightening her chest as the officers closed in. "Mum, step aside and show us your hands," one barked, his tone taut with authority. She complied instantly, raising her hands, coffee still clutched in one, her pulse hammering. "Officers, what's happening?" she asked, her voice leveled despite the shock rippling through her. Harriet rushed forward, her shrill voice cutting through the murmurs of onlookers. "That's her. She was acting so suspicious he had to call. She might be dangerous." Jasmine's gaze landed on Harriet, taking in her wild eyes, her trembling frame. Realization dawned, cold and heavy. "Ma'am, I assure you, there's a misunderstanding," she began. But the words evaporated as an officer ordered her hands behind her back. Another patted her down, his fingers brushing the concealed holster at her waist. "We've got a weapon," he shouted, yanking out her Sederma standard issue for her undercover work. The air thickened with tension, and Jasmine's mind raced. Harriet's reckless fear had spun a web of lies, ensnaring her in a trap of misplaced justice. And as the cuffs clicked shut, the bitter truth settled in: power wielded without reason. could twist innocence into guilt in the blink of an eye. The air in downtown Atlanta buzzed with the hum of a typical Saturday morning. Cars honking faintly in the distance, the aroma of roasted coffee drifting from nearby shops, and the chatter of pedestrians weaving through the streets. Amid this ordinary rhythm, chaos erupted in an instant. Jasmine Owens, a seasoned CIA agent, stood just outside a quaint coffee shop, her sharp eyes scanning her surroundings as she awaited a critical meeting with an informant. She wore a tailored blazer, its dark fabric concealing the legally registered sidearm holstered at her side. A tool of her trade she carried with quiet confidence. Her fingers brushed her phone as she checked the time, her mind already racing through the details of her covert assignment. She barely noticed the woman watching her from a few feet away, Harriet Mansfield, a nervous civilian whose imagination had spiraled into a dangerous assumption. In a heartbeat, everything shifted. Harriet, her face taut with unwarranted suspicion, had dialed 911, her voice trembling as she whispered about a threat she perceived in Jasmine's poised demeanor and the way she glanced around. Before Jasmine could fully register the approaching footsteps, two uniformed officers stormed toward her, their boots pounding the pavement with urgency. She raised her hands instinctively, her voice steady as she called out, "I'm a federal agent." But the words drowned in the whirlwind of confusion. The officers, fueled by incomplete information and Harriet's frantic pointing, didn't hesitate. Within seconds, Jasmine's arms were twisted behind her back, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into her wrists. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the sharp sting of disbelief and frustration surging through her veins. A crowd began to gather, drawn like moths to the sudden flare of drama. Smartphones emerged from pockets, their lenses glinting as passers-by angled for the perfect shot of the unfolding scene. Jasmine stood tall despite the restraints, her jaw clenched as she fought to maintain the calm professionalism that had carried her through years of high-stakes missions. She could feel the weight of every stare, the silent judgments flickering in the eyes of strangers who didn't know her truth. "I'm a CIA agent," she repeated, her tone firm yet laced with an undercurrent of exasperation. "My credentials are in my blazer pocket. Check them." One officer, a weary young man with a tense expression, hesitated before reaching into her pocket. His fingers fumbled as he retrieved her wallet, flipping it open to reveal the unmistakable CIA identification card nestled inside. Time seemed to freeze. The Officer Kim, his badge read, blinked hard, his brow furrowing as he examined the card. Jasmine's photograph stared back at him, flanked by a serial number and holographic seals that shimmered under the sunlight. He shot a glance at his partner, Sergeant Boyd, an older man with weathered lines etched into his face from years on the force. Their eyes met in a silent exchange, a mix of alarm and uncertainty rippling between them. Jasmine stood motionless, her dark eyes locked on the officers as she willed her voice to remain steady. "My name is Jasmine Owens," she said, each syllable deliberate. "I'm with the CIA, on official business here in Atlanta. That sidearm is legal, registered, and part of my job." Her gaze flicked briefly to Harriet, who lingered on the sidelines, her face flushed with a strange cocktail of triumph and dread. Inside, Jasmine's thoughts churned. This woman called the cops on me for no reason at all, and now she's about to unravel a mess she can't even fathom. The officer's initial shock was tangible, a wave of realization crashing over them as they processed the gravity of the situation. Sergeant Boyd stepped forward, his voice gruff but tinged with a newfound caution. "Let's take a closer look at that badge, ma'am," he said, his fingers carefully sliding the ID from the wallet. He held it up, tilting it to catch the light, his eyes narrowing as he confirmed its authenticity. The weight of his mistake settled into his shoulders, and the color drained from his face, leaving him pale against the backdrop of the bustling street. Beside him, Officer Kim shifted uneasily, his youthful bravado replaced by a flicker of doubt. "Are you sure this is legit?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost hopeful that it might not be true. Jasmine nodded, her composure unshaken despite the anger simmering beneath her surface. "I'm Jasmine Owens, CIA," she repeated. "I'm working a covert assignment in Atlanta. You can verify it with headquarters or run the ID through your system. I don't take kindly to being tackled and disarmed without cause." Sergeant Boyd's demeanor softened, the aggression of moments ago giving way to a reluctant respect shadowed by embarrassment. He rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting hers again. "We got a call about suspicious behavior," he murmured, almost apologetically. "We had to respond." Jasmine's eyes darted to Harriet, who stood clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles gleamed white against her skin. Harriet's face was a mask of shock, her lips parted as if words had abandoned her. But beneath the surface, Jasmine could see the slow dawning of regret, the creeping recognition that she'd misjudged everything. Harriet's heart thundered in her chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the noise of the crowd. CIA, she's CIA, her mind screamed, panic clawing its way up her spine as she replayed her actions in a loop of dread. Jasmine faced the officers again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Is there any reason to keep me in cuffs now that you know who I am and that my weapon is legal?" The question hung in the air, calm but edged with an unmistakable challenge. Sergeant Boyd nodded quickly to Officer Kim, who fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the handcuffs. They fell away with a soft clink, and Jasmine flexed her wrists, the red marks left by the metal a quiet testament to the ordeal. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting, replaced almost instantly by the bitter aftertaste of humiliation. The crowd still lingered, some filming with unabashed curiosity, their whispers a dull roar in her ears. She knew how fast this could spiral online, how a single video could paint her as a villain or a victim, stripping away the nuance of her identity. For a black woman, even one with CIA credentials, the stakes were always higher, the margin for error razor thin. Harriet, meanwhile, stood rooted to the spot, her world tilting beneath her feet. "I am sorry," she stammered, her voice so faint it barely reached Jasmine's ears. Fear and guilt twisted inside her, a storm she couldn't quell, but her pride clung stubbornly. Refusing to let her fully surrender to remorse, she coughed, grasping for an explanation. "I thought he mean, I saw you messing with your phone and looking around. I was worried." Jasmine's gaze locked onto her, dark and unyielding, though she forced herself to keep her tone even. "You thought I was a criminal because I was checking my phone in a coffee shop?" she asked, the words measured but heavy with implication. Harriet's eyes dropped to her shoes, her silence a confession she couldn't voice. Turning back to Sergeant Boyd, Jasmine straightened her posture, her professionalism a shield against the chaos. "I'll need a copy of the police report for this," she said. "And the name of the caller who made the report." Boyd nodded, his expression grim. "We'll file an official report, Miss Owens. We'll need your statement too. As for the caller, it's public record Harriet Mansfield." The name seared into Jasmine's memory, a quiet promise of accountability. She knew Harriet's type to whelp paranoid, prejudiced, and all too eager to wield law enforcement as a weapon against people who didn't fit her narrow view of safety. It wasn't the first time Jasmine had faced this kind of bias, though never so publicly, so rawly. In her covert work, her skills earned respect from colleagues, and her enemies rarely saw her coming. But this was prejudice laid bare, a reckless act that could have ended in tragedy if the officers had been less restrained, or she less composed. Her focus snapped back to the mission. She glanced at her watch, already late for her informant meeting. "I'll need my weapon back," she said, her tone clipped as she eyed Officer Kim. He hesitated, then handed it over, grip first, after one last glance at her ID. Jasmine secured it in her holster, smoothing her blazer as her pulse steadied. The crowd had thickened, a ring of onlookers murmuring among themselves. Some caught wind of her CIA status, their voices dropping to a hushed awe, while others muttered about racial profiling, their words sharp with indignation. Harriet's cheeks burned, the heat rising as if she'd stepped from a fire. She longed to melt into the sea of faces, to escape the weight of her mistake, but a stubborn impulse wrestled with her growing shame, urging her to justify herself even as the truth sank in. Sergeant Boyd cleared his throat, his tone gentler now. "Miss Owens, I apologize for the inconvenience. You know how these calls go, have to check them out. Can you confirm your plans so we can close this as a false alarm?" Jasmine met his gaze, her response crisp. "I have a meeting at Industrious Peachtree, the co-working space down the block. If you need more, my supervisor at Langley can back me up. He'll give you his contact." Boyd scribbled notes, nodding as he processed her words. "I'll file it as unfounded suspicious activity," he said, a hint of regret in his voice. "Sorry again for the trouble." Jasmine gave a cool nod, then turned to Harriet, her eyes piercing. "I'm late for my meeting," she said, her words sharp and final. "But you and I will likely cross paths again." Without waiting for a reply, she slipped into the flow of pedestrians, her figure vanishing into the crowd, her composure intact but her mind ablaze. Harriet remained frozen, the stares of strangers prickling her skin. Her chest tightened, regret pulsing through her with every ragged breath. She approached Sergeant Boyd, her voice trembling. "Is this going on record?" He glanced at her, his look more pity than scorn. "We document everything, your statement, the ID check, the call. Miss Owens might pursue legal action if she thinks you filed a false report. That's not up to us." Harriet's world shrank to the thud of her heartbeat. The lesson stark and inescapable. Justice wasn't a tool to be wielded lightly, and the consequences of abusing power or fear could ripple far beyond this moment. For Jasmine, it was more than an inconvenience. It was a call to action, a reminder that accountability must follow prejudice, lest the scales of justice tip too far. The word lawyer crashed into Harriet like a thunderclap, reverberating through her chest and leaving her dizzy. Her knees wobbled as she stood there, the weight of it all pressing down on her frail shoulders. She couldn't afford a fancy legal fee. Their income was a patchwork of her late husband's pension, and a modest inheritance that barely kept her afloat. As the crowd around her began to thin out, drifting away like leaves in the wind, Harriet stumbled backward, her body slumping against the cool glass of the Starbucks window. Inside, her salted caramel mocha sat abandoned on the table, the whipped cream melting into a sad puddle, untouched and forgotten just like her sense of certainty. Across town, Jasmine's day unfolded with a different rhythm. Her meeting at Industrious Peachtree with her informant had gone off without a hitch. The man, a soft-spoken accountant with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous tic, had uncovered something rotten in his company's books transactions that stank of cartel money. He slid a USB drive across the table, his fingers trembling slightly as he did. Jasmine took it with a nod, her sharp eyes confirming what she'd suspected. These digital breadcrumbs led straight to a shadowy, cartel-backed entity. She retreated to a private cubicle, the hum of the co-working space fading into a dull buzz as she plugged in her laptop. For hours, she worked with mechanical precision uploading encrypted files to Langley, drafting a detailed summary for her superiors. But beneath her calm, professional exterior, a storm brewed. Her mind kept snagging on the scene outside Starbucks earlier that day. Each time she paused to sip her water or rub her eyes, she could feel the phantom bite of handcuffs tightening around her wrists again. The cold metal a lingering echo of humiliation. Anger simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over, but she forced it down. She had a job to do. Meanwhile, Harriet's evening spiraled into chaos. She tore out of the Starbucks parking lot, her sedan weaving dangerously close to a trash bin as she sped toward Buckhead. The traffic lights blurred into streaks of red and green. She couldn't focus, her mind a whirlwind of regret and fear. Over and over, she relived the moment Jasmine had flashed her CIA credentials, the revelation hitting Harriet like a slap. Her stomach churned as she imagined herself drowning in legal fees, her modest savings evaporating, or worse, being branded a criminal. By the time she pulled into the driveway of her pristine Victorian home, its gabled roof and wraparound porch no longer felt like a sanctuary. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her with their silence. Her dog, Tucker, bounded to the door, barking excitedly, but Harriet barely registered his presence. Her purse hit the kitchen table with a dull thud as she collapsed into a chair, her fingers pressing hard against her throbbing temples. Desperate for an anchor, she grabbed her phone and dialed Margaret, her old friend and a retired paralegal. The line rang 5 times before Margaret picked up, her voice thick with sleep. Harriet hadn't even noticed the clock ticking past 9 p.m. "Margaret, I messed up," she blurted, her voice quivering like a leaf in a storm. She spilled everything: the confrontation, the humiliation, the dread, leaving no detail unspoken. Margaret listened patiently, offering soft hums of sympathy. When Harriet finally ran out of steam, a heavy silence stretched between them. Then Margaret spoke. Her words measured but firm. "Harriet, this is serious. You filed a false report. If you had no evidence, just suspicion, that woman could have grounds to sue you. Civil suits for defamation or discrimination happen all the time, and people win them." Harriet's stomach plummeted, a cold sweat breaking out across her skin. She pictured herself in a courtroom, Jasmine on one side flanked by slick CIA lawyers, while Harriet stood alone, defenseless. "What do I do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't go to jail." Margaret tried to steady her, suggesting an apology, maybe a letter to Jasmine, or even hiring a lawyer fast. It was practical advice, but to Harriet, it felt like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. She hated the thought of groveling, but the terror gnawing at her pride was stronger. She promised Margaret she'd figure something out, then hung up. That night, for the first time in years, Harriet didn't sleep. She lay awake, her father's old warnings about vigilance echoing in her head, now twisted into a bitter lesson about how horribly she'd misjudged the world. For days later, the machinery of justice kicked into high gear. Jasmine and the CIA's legal team had moved swiftly, looping in the local district attorney's office after Jasmine filed a formal complaint about the false police report. Racial profiling cases had spiked across the country, and this one carried extra weight. Jasmine wasn't just anyone. She was a federal agent on duty. What Harriet didn't know was how deep Jasmine's influence ran. Her father, Daniel Owens, had been a heavy hitter at the Department of Justice, working on civil rights enforcement before he retired. Even now, his Rolodex brimmed with powerful contacts, law wires who lived for cases like this. When Jasmine called him that weekend, laying out the Starbucks fiasco, Daniel's voice had roared with indignation over the line. He insisted on hooking her up with his old colleagues. Jasmine appreciated his fire, but she tempered it with her own sense of balance. She didn't want revenge, she wanted accountability, a clean line drawn between right and wrong. The DA's office took her complaint seriously, planning to haul Harriet in for questioning. They made it clear Jasmine had every right to sue for the emotional toll and the risk Harriet's actions had caused. Jasmine hadn't decided yet. In her quieter moments, she wondered if Harriet was less evil than clueless. But she also knew ignorance wasn't an excuse, not when it fueled harm, especially to black communities who bore the scars of profiling far too often. While all this brewed, Jasmine stayed laser-focused on her CIA mission. She gathered enough evidence to tie a local shell company to cartel money laundering, phone records, bank transfers, the works. A federal sting was coming together, slated for the next few weeks. If Harriet only knew how close she'd come to derailing a top-secret op by sticking her nose where it didn't belong, she might have seen the bigger picture. Jasmine mused on it sometimes. Maybe this would finally teach Harriet that her snap judgments carried a cost. On the fifth day, Jasmine's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She picked up, and a shaky voice crackled through. "Miss Owens, this is Harriet Mansfield. I got your number from the police report. I'd like to talk. Could we meet, please?" Jasmine froze, a mix of shock and wariness washing over her. She nearly snapped a refusal to let Harriet stew in her mess, but something stopped her. Curiosity, maybe, or that stubborn streak of fairness she couldn't shake. "Why?" she asked, her tone flat. Harriet stumbled over her words. "I feel awful. I want to apologize, explain myself. I know it might not mean much now, but I want to try to fix this." Jasmine let the silence hang, weighing Harriet's voice. It wasn't remorse she heard so much as raw panic, but it was enough. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., same Starbucks," Jasmine said coolly. "You've got 10 minutes. Harriet's thank you was a choked whisper before the line went dead. That night, Harriet didn't sleep a wink. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows danced across it, her mind replaying the week's chaos. The DA's office had officially summoned her for questioning in 2 days about that 911 call. Margaret had pulled strings to get her a defense attorney, a gruff man who didn't mince words. "You had no evidence, just a hunch. That's a misdemeanor false report at best, civil litigation at worst." He'd urged her to show good faith, reach out to Jasmine. So here she was, trembling as she walked back into Starbucks the next morning. She ordered a grande black coffee she wouldn't drink, her hands shaking as she carried it to a table in the back. The exposed brick walls loomed like a prison, the coffee scent turning her stomach. Just a week ago, she'd sat here sipping her mocha, smug in her certainty. Now, she felt like a fool. At 9 o'clock sharp, Jasmine strode in, her dark green blouse crisp, her black pants tailored to perfection. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew her worth, her eyes sweeping the room until they landed on Harriet. Harriet's heart stuttered. She's got power, she thought, feeling the chasm between them widen. Jasmine, the CIA operative. Harriet, the meddling nobody. She stood, awkward and unsteady, raising a hand in a feeble wave. This wasn't just about an apology anymore, it was about facing the wreckage of her choices, and the hard truth that justice didn't bend for pride or prejudice. On a crisp morning, the sunlight filtered weakly through the Starbucks windows, casting faint shadows across the wooden tables. Jasmine approached with a deliberate elegance, her movements smooth yet restrained, like a dancer holding back her full grace. Her hand hesitated midair for a split second before offering a curt wavy gesture that carried neither warmth nor hostility. She bypassed the usual small talk, skipping over any polite chatter, and slid into the seat across from Harriet. Her eyes locked onto Harriet's with a stillness that felt heavy, a quiet intensity that seemed to fill the space between them with unspoken weight. Harriet fidgeted under that gaze, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee cup. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until she couldn't bear it any longer. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you're busy, important." The words stumbled out, clumsy in their sincerity. Jasmine gave a small shrug, barely a ripple in her composed demeanor. "You called," she replied simply, her tone even. "What did you want to say?" Harriet swallowed hard, her throat tight with a mix of dread and shame. "I am sorry," she began, her voice cracking as she forced the words out. "I realize now how irrationally I acted. When I saw you, I just assumed." Her sentence drifted off, unfinished, as if the rest were too heavy to lift into the air. Jasmine's silence bore down on her, a steady, unflinching scrutiny that made Harriet's skin prickle. She tried again, desperation creeping in. "I've been on edge for years. My father drilled it into me, over and over, that I needed to watch out for criminals, especially in parts of the city I don't know well. That fear it twisted into something ugly. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting myself, but now I see it was just prejudice." Jasmine listened, her face a mask of neutrality, betraying nothing. Then, softly, almost gently, she spoke. "And you think that excuses it?" The question hung there, delicate yet piercing. Harriet shook her head quickly, tears welling up and threatening to spill over. No. I don't think it's okay. That's why I'm here. I know you could press charges and you'd be right too. I wouldn't blame you. I need you to know how sorry I am. I want to make this right, somehow, or at least make it better." Her hands trembled on the table, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to hold herself together. A brief hush settled over them, the ambient hum of the coffee shop fading into the background. Jasmine studied Harriet closely, her sharp eyes catching the faint quiver in Harriet's fingers, the glossy sheen of unshed tears. Years of training had honed Jasmine's ability to read people, to peel back the layers of their words and see the truth beneath. Harriet's fear was palpable, raw and real, and her remorse seemed to pulse with genuine weight. Yet Jasmine also sensed the undercurrent of self-preservation, driving her legal consequences, loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. Finally, Jasmine broke the silence, her voice steady but firm. "Harriet, I'm not here to shame you into the ground, but what you did wasn't just fear. You profiled me. You saw a black woman sitting in a coffee shop, glancing at her phone, and decided I must be trouble. You turned that snap judgment into a weapon-dealed 911, and that could have gone so wrong. I've got training to handle situations like that, but imagine if it had been someone else. Someone without my experience, without credentials to flash, someone who might have panicked or fought back. That call could have ruined a lifer-ended one." Harriet's head dropped, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, leaving faint streaks on her pale skin. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm learning. I see it now. I'm so ashamed. Her breath hitched, a shaky sigh escaping her lips as she tried to steady herself. Jasmine leaned forward just a fraction, her presence commanding yet not unkind. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why you're so afraid, or tried to push back against it? You live in a city that's mostly black, Harriet. If that scares you this much, maybe it's time to look hard at yourself and figure out why. Harriet nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. A wave of humiliation crashed over her as memories of her father's stern warnings replayed in her Mindus voice, gruff and insistent, telling her to stay vigilant, to distrust anyone who didn't look like them. She'd swallowed those lessons whole, never questioning them, letting them fester into something toxic. You're right, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I've never faced it. I just believed him. I thought I was keeping myself safe. Now I see how much damage that's done. They sat there for a moment, the air between them heavy with the weight of their words. Jasmine watched Harriet's shoulders tremble, her breaths uneven as she fought to compose herself. Despite the bitterness still simmering in her chest sting of being reduced to a stereotype, in a split second Jasmine felt a flicker of something softer. Pity, perhaps. She knew racism wasn't always born in someone's heart. Often, it was planted there, watered by fear and ignorance. It could be uprooted, too, but only if Harriet was willing to dig deep and confront the roots herself. The DA wants to talk to you, Jasmine said at last, her tone measured. My lawyers are looking into a civil suit, too. Harriet nodded, dabbing at her tears with a crumpled tissue. I know. I'm meeting with them. I'll tell them everything whatever they need to hear. Jasmine took a slow, deliberate breath, her eyes narrowing slightly. I want more than words, Harriet. I want you to do something real. Maybe volunteer with a civil rights group, or take a course on racial bias. You need to put in the work not just for me, but for anyone else you might hurt down the line. Harriet's head bobbed eagerly, a spark of desperation in her eyes. Yes, I can do that. I will do that, she said, her voice urgent, grasping for any lifeline toward redemption. She rambled for a moment, recounting vague ideas her friend Margaret had tossed out: community outreach programs, workshops, something tangible to show she meant it. She wasn't sure where to start, her thoughts a jumbled mess, but she wanted Jasmine to see her intent, to believe she could change. Jasmine remained guarded, her expression unreadable, but she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. All right, she said, rising from her chair. If you follow through, maybe we'll talk again someday, something more meaningful. For now, focus on doing right by the DA. If they press charges, that's their call. I won't stop them. Relief washed over Harriet, tinged with a gnawing dread. Jasmine wasn't out to crush her completely, but the legal tightrope she walked was still taut and unforgiving. As Jasmine turned to leave, Harriet's voice burst out, unsteady and pleading. Can you forgive me? Jasmine paused, her hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, her gaze unwavering. Forgiveness isn't a gift I hand out, she said simply. It's earned. With that, she walked out, her steps steady and unhurried, leaving Harriet staring after her, the weight of her words sinking deep. 2 weeks later, Harriet stood in the echoing halls of the Fulton County Courthouse, her heart pounding so fiercely she swore it reverberated off the polished marble walls. She'd dressed carefully, her best black pencil skirt hugging her hips, a modest blouse buttoned up to her collarbone, hoping the outfit might lend her some semblance of control in a situation spiraling far beyond her grasp. Her attorney, Richard Hale, stood beside her, a middle-aged man with a perpetually furrowed brow and a demeanor as stiff as his starched shirt. The district attorney's office had moved with startling speed, scheduling a preliminary hearing to decide if Harriet would face criminal charges for filing a false police report. If the judge found probable cause, a formal arraignment loomed, an official step toward a trial that could unravel her life entirely. The hallway buzzed with restless energy. Defense lawyers thumbed through thick stacks of notes, their faces etched with focus. Defendants slumped on benches, heads bowed under the weight of their fates. Family members lingered nearby, whispering anxiously or staring blankly at the walls. To Harriet, it felt like a dream caught in slow motion, not a pleasant one, but a nightmare where every detail sharpened into cruel clarity. The air was stale, tinged with the faint scent of cleaning solution, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow. She was used to the plush comfort of country clubs, the soft clink of wine glasses not this cold. Institutional reality. At exactly 9 a.m., a bailiff's voice cut through the clamor, summoning them into a small courtroom. Harriet's legs felt leaden as she stepped inside, her heels clicking faintly against the linoleum floor. Judge Monique Daniels presided from a raised desk, her presence commanding the room with an effortless authority. An African-American woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense posture, she seemed to embody the very justice Harriet now feared. Jasmine sat at a table near the front, flanked by an assistant district attorney. Dressed in a crisp dark suit, her expression was as steady as ever, her gaze locking onto Harriet with a quiet intensity that made Harriet's stomach twist into knots. Guilt lodged in her throat like a stone, heavy and immovable. The assistant DA opened the proceedings, his voice clipped and precise as he recounted the incident. Harriet's 911 call, Jasmine's detention, the ripple of chaos that followed. He noted Jasmine's CIA credentials, carefully avoiding the specifics of her assignment, and emphasized that she'd been legally armed, sitting in that Starbucks with every right to be there. Harriet's suspicions, he argued, had been baseless, rooted in nothing but her own warped perceptions. When it was Harriet's turn, Richard stepped forward, his tone measured but firm. "Miss Mansfield deeply regrets her actions," he said. "She acted under an honest, though mistaken, belief of suspicious behavior. We intend to demonstrate there was no willful intent to deceive." Judge Daniels' expression remained stony, her lips a tight line as she turned to Harriet. "Miss Mansfield," she said, her voice low and resonant, "in your own words, explain why you made that call about Miss Owens." Harriet's hands shook as she gripped a crumpled note card, her prepared statement feeling flimsy now. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quivering. "Too was scared. I saw Miss Owens doing things I thought looked suspicious, and I panicked. I've since realized my biases drove me to act without evidence. I'm so sorry for the harm I caused." The words felt inadequate, crumbling under the weight of the courtroom's silence. The judge's eyes flicked to Jasmine. "Miss Owens, would you like to address the court?" Jasmine stood, her posture regal, her voice clear and unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to stress that Miss Mansfield's actions weren't harmless. I was detained, humiliated, and it could have escalated far worse. As a black woman, I know all too well how these baseless calls can end sometimes in tragedy. Beyond that, I was on official government business, and her call disrupted my work." She paused, letting the words settle, then continued. "I'll acknowledge she's apologized and started to recognize her prejudice. But I believe the evidence shows her call was reckless, made without regard for the truth." Each syllable struck Harriet like a physical blow, shame curling tighter around her chest. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, and escape the piercing reality of Jasmine's testimony. Judge Daniels listened intently, her fingers steepled, then turned to the assistant DA. "Does the state intend to pursue charges?" The man nodded briskly. "We do, Your Honor. We have statements from Starbucks customers and responding officers confirming Miss Owens posed no threat. The call was unfounded and dangerous." The hearing stretched on, but Harriet's mind blurred, trapped in a haze of regret and fear. Jasmine's words echoed in her skull. Justice wasn't just about intent, it was about consequences. Harriet had wielded her fear like a loaded gun, and now the fallout was hers to face. The lesson burned deep. Power, even the small power to point a finger, carried a weight she'd never understood until it crashed down on her. The courtroom buzzed with a tense, electric stillness as Judge Daniels swept his gaze across the assembled crowd, his dark eyes glinting with a mixture of stern resolve and fleeting compassion. Harriet Mansfield sat rigid, her breath shallow, feeling the weight of those eyes settle on her like a storm cloud ready to burst. "Miss Mansfield," the judge began, his voice steady but laced with a gravity that made the air feel heavier. "Racial profiling and the reckless misuse of emergency services are matters I view with the utmost seriousness. They erode trust, sow division, and undermine the very fabric of justice. Yet I also detect a thread of remorse in you, a recognition, perhaps, of the harm you've caused." We will move forward to trial unless a plea can be negotiated. I'm setting the date for 6 weeks from today." A hush blanketed the room, thick and suffocating. Harriet's mouth turned to sandpaper, her tongue sticking uselessly to the roof as panic clawed at her chest. A trial. This wasn't some fleeting moment of public shame she could shrug off with an apology. And a forced smile. This was real, raw, and inescapable. She whipped her head toward her attorney, Richard Hale, her wide eyes pleading for rescue. He rested a steady hand on her shoulder, a silent anchor in the chaos, though his lips remained sealed, offering no words to ease her spiraling dread. Judge Daniels leaned forward slightly, his tone softening but still firm. "I strongly urge both parties to explore a resolution before we reach that point. Court is adjourned." The gavel cracked like thunder, its echo reverberating in Harriet's skull as the room began to stir. Jasmine Owens, poised and unflinching, gathered her things alongside the assistant district attorney. Harriet's gaze darted toward her, a desperate, unspoken plea shimmering in her eyes. She wanted to say something, anything, bridge the chasm her actions had carved between them. But Jasmine's face, calm yet impenetrable, turned away, leaving Harriet adrift in a sea of guilt and the fading sound of that gavel. As Jasmine exited, Harriet felt the floor tilt beneath her, the reality of what lay ahead sinking deep into her bones. The 6 weeks before the trial stretched into an eternity of sleepless nights and relentless worry for Harriet. Her attorney shuttled back and forth with the district attorney's office, bartering over plea deals while she sat at home, drowning in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her laptop glowed late into the night as she scoured the internet, fingers trembling over the keyboard as she typed phrases like criminal misdemeanor penalties, racial profiling lawsuits, and false police report consequences. Each search result tightened the knot in her stomach. Fines loomed large, probation felt suffocating, and the specter of jail time hung over her like a guillotine. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, an anvil of anxiety she couldn't shake. Meanwhile, Jasmine wrestled with her own storm. Her CIA mission, a meticulous sting operation targeting a cartel-backed shell company, was in full swing. She'd spent months mapping out the web of key players, their coded exchanges, and their laundered profits. Now, she coordinated with local law enforcement, her voice crisp and authoritative over secure lines as she orchestrated the final moves for a flawless takedown. Her focus should have been razor-sharp, every ounce of her energy poured into the mission. Yet Harriet Mansfield's shadow lingered, an unwelcome intruder in her mind. The irony wasn't lost on Jasmine. A case born from baseless suspicion now threatened to distract her from dismantling a real threat. The media hadn't helped. Jasmine's name had leaked, splashed across local headlines as the CIA agent racially profiled at Starbucks. Reporters hounded her for interviews, their emails piling up unanswered as she waved them off, citing her classified role. Still, the spotlight burned hot, illuminating both her and Harriet in a glare neither wanted. For Jasmine, it was a bitter pill. Her career demanded discretion, yet here she was, a reluctant symbol of something larger than herself. When the trial day dawned, the courthouse steps swarmed with news vans and flashing cameras. A chaotic circus Judge Daniels had mercifully banned from the courtroom itself. Harriet stepped through the throng, her navy dress modest and understated, her hair pulled back in a tight bun that mirrored the tension in her frame. She felt exposed, every click of a shutter slicing into her already frayed nerves. Jasmine arrived moments later, her presence quieter but commanding, flanked by the ADA and an expectedly Department of Justice official. Drawn by the case's civil rights undertones, the air crackled with unspoken stakes as they entered, the weight of justice hanging thickly round them. Jury selection had been a swift, brutal dance. Most candidates recognized the case, instantly a lightning rod of racial bias and public reckoning. Some leaned forward in their seats, eager to weigh in. Others shifted uncomfortably, wishing to be anywhere else. The final panel was a patchwork of facemen and women, young and old, black, white, and brown, each bringing their own silent judgments to the table. Richard Hale had fought hard to filter out those he feared would condemn Harriet outright, his sharp questions probing for bias, but he knew the odds were steep. Once the trial began, the district attorney wasted no time. The facts unfurled like a grim tapestry. Harriet's 911 call, rooted in prejudice rather than evidence. The responding officer's testimony that Jasmine had been calm, cooperative, her firearm credentials impeccable. The Starbucks patrons who swore Jasmine had done nothing to warrant suspicion. The baristas who recalled her warm smile and casual chatter over the counter. It all wove together into a stark portrait. Harriet's fear had been a fiction of her own making, a phantom conjured from the shadows of her mind. Richard Hale countered with a delicate balancing act. Harriet, he argued, had been genuinely mistaken, her call driven by a misplaced concern for public safety rather than malice. And look, he urged the jury, she was remorseful, ready to own her mistake and face the fallout. When Harriet took the stand, her voice trembled, tears spilling freely as she bared her soul. She spoke of her childhood, of a father who'd filled her head with whispered warnings about those people, planting seeds of fear that had grown unchecked. She described the gut-wrenching moment she'd watched Jasmine in handcuffs, only to learn the truth, a CIA agent, not a threat. Her words broke as she admitted, "I deserve this. I deserve to face what I've done." The courtroom held its breath, her raw confession echoing off the walls. Then Jasmine testified, her voice a steady current cutting through the room's tension. She recounted the incident with precision, sudden humiliation of being detained in public, the cold metal of cuffs biting into her wrists, the stares of strangers boring into her. She spoke of the deeper toll, the way such moments gnawed at Black lives, eroding safety and dignity, especially for those without her badge to shield them. Her composure never wavered, but her sincerity struck like a hammer, and the jury shifted uneasily, the air thick with her understated power. She added, almost as an afterthought, how Harriet's call had nearly derailed her mission in Atlanta. Fleeting detail that landed like a quiet bombshell. The trial's turning point came unexpectedly. The Department of Justice representative rose, requesting to introduce new evidence. Harriet's 911 call history. The records painted a chilling picture. Over the years, she'd made half a dozen calls, each targeting Black individuals in her neighborhood for mundane acts like lingering at a bus stop or chatting on a phone outside. Never once had she dialed about a white person, not even when her street rang with loud parties or odd-hour loiterers. The pattern was undeniable, a stark thread of prejudice woven through time. The courtroom gasped, a ripple of shock spreading as Harriet shrank into her seat, tears streaking her face. She glanced at Margaret, her old friend in the gallery, whose sorrowful eyes mirrored her own despair. Richard Hale leapt to object, insisting the older calls were irrelevant to the Starbucks incident. But the DA pressed back. They showed Harriet's mindset, her ingrained lens of suspicion. Judge Daniels allowed it, his ruling a quiet thunderclap that sealed Harriet's fate. With that evidence laid bare, Richard knew the tide had turned. During a recess, frantic whispers buzzed between the legal teams and Jasmine, negotiations teetering on a razor's edge. Finally, a deal emerged. Harriet would plead guilty to a misdemeanor false report charge, pay a steep fine, complete anti-bias training, and serve a year on probation. It was a lifeline. Had she rolled the dice at trial, the punishment could have been far worse. In open court, Harriet's guilty plea came through sobs, her voice quaking as she faced Judge Daniels. "I plead guilty, Your Honor. I take full responsibility for what I've done." The judge nodded, praising Jasmine's grace under fire and Harriet's belated accountability. He imposed the sentence, a $5,000 fine, a year of probation, and mandatory racial bias training. As Harriet left the courtroom, she caught Jasmine's eye in the hallway. She offered a faint, tearful note of fragile olive branch. Jasmine returned a distant glance, not warm but not cold either, a look of quiet closure. The aftermath reshaped Harriet's world. At an age when she'd expected golden years of ease, she found herself tethered to a probation officer, a young Black man, whose polite firmness forced her to confront her past weekly. The racial bias program was grueling, peeling back layers of her psyche she'd never dared touch. She sat in those sessions, raw and uncomfortable, unraveling her father's lessons and grappling with the systemic roots of her fear. It was humbling, humiliating even, but a flicker of hope stirred. She could change, couldn't she? The fine and legal fees bit deep, forcing her to pawn her grandmother's brooch. a loss that stung like salt in a wound. Her country club friends drifted away, their silence louder than any rebuke, leaving her isolated but oddly open to something new. Jasmine, meanwhile, saw her mission through. The cartel sting ended in triumphalists. Seized millions, a clean sweep. Her CIA peers lauded her, and a commendation awaited back at Langley, accepted with the same understated dignity she'd carried throughout. On her final day in Atlanta, she stood at the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site, the air heavy with history, reflecting on justice, consequence, and the long road still ahead for her, for Harriet, for them all. Harriet's fall was a lesson etched in stone. Power misused brings reckoning, and true justice demands not just punishment, but transformation. Under the vast, cloud-streaked sky at the historical park, where the humble birthplace of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood as a silent testament to a relentless dream, Jasmine Owens lingered in quiet contemplation. The air carried a faint chill, the kind that sharpens the senses and stirs the soul. She traced her fingers along the weathered plaque, her dark eyes reflecting the weight of history. Society had clawed its way forward since the days of Dr. King's marsh progress etched in laws, in faces once excluded now seated at tables of power, but the road ahead stretched long and uneven still. His words echoed in her mind, steady as a heartbeat. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. They weren't just a call to action, they were a mirror held up to the world and to her own life. Standing there, Jasmine felt a resolve take root, sober, unyielding, like a tree weathering a storm. She was a black woman in America, an agent of change in a nation that sometimes resisted it. And the fight was far from over. Earlier that year, a small but jagged wound had opened in her life, one that seemed trivial at first glance, but cut deeper the more she examined it. It started at a Starbucks, of all places a mundane backdrop for a moment that would ripple outward. Harriet Mansfield, a weary woman with graying hair and a pinched expression, had dialed 911 over Jasmine's presence, her voice trembling with a fear she couldn't or wouldn't name. To Harriet, Jasmine was a stranger lingering too long over her coffee, a vague threat conjured by years of unspoken bias. To Jasmine, it was a personal sting, a pinprick of indignity that bled into the larger tapestry of racial prejudice she'd spent her life unraveling. She didn't just see Harriet's call as an isolated slight. It was a thread in a web that stretched across generations, fragile yet stubborn, demanding tireless effort to tear apart. And tear it apart she would, with the quiet ferocity that defined her. Now, with her time in Atlanta drawing to a close, Jasmine found herself guided by an impulse she hadn't planned. Her rolling suitcase bumped along the cracked sidewalk as she approached Harriet's modest home, a single-story house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of gold and gray. She wasn't in her usual crisp blazer and badged Adidas jeans, a faded sweater, and a resolve she couldn't shake. Tucker, Harriet's scruffy little dock dog, bounded to the door first, yapping with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, his tail wagging uncertainly. Harriet followed, her movements hesitant as she cracked the door open. Her eyes widened at the sight of Jasmine standing there, unguarded and unannounced. For a moment, neither spoke of their thick with the unspoken weight of their shared history. "Jasmine," Harriet's voice quavered, a mix of shock and something softer, something raw. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, betraying the nerves she tried to mask. What are you doing here?" "I'm leaving town," Jasmine replied, her tone steady but not cold. She nudged her suitcase slightly with her foot, as if to anchor herself in the moment. "But I wanted to stop by. See how you're doing." Harriet blinked, her eyes glistening with the sudden threat of tears. She stepped back, gesturing awkwardly. "Come in, please." The invitation felt fragile, like it might shatter if pressed too hard. Jasmine crossed the threshold, Tucker sniffing at her heels, his tiny paws clicking on the hardwood floor. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood, but it lacked the prim, orderly energy Harriet usually exuded. The curtains hung slightly askew, and a stack of unopened mail cluttered the counter, quiet chaos that mirrored the woman herself. They settled at the kitchen table, a chipped oak relic that creaked under the weight of their silence. Harriet bustled briefly, retrieving a pitcher of sweet tea from the fridge. Her hands trembling as she poured a glass, the amber liquid sloshed slightly. A small spill she didn't bother to wipe up. "I've been meaning to say it again," she began, her voice cracking like thin ice. "I'm so sorry. Jasmine, for everything." Jasmine raised a hand, gentle but firm, cutting the apology short. "I'm not here to dig up the past," she said, her gaze locking with Harriet's. "I just hope you'll keep going with the bias program. That's what matters now." Her words were soft, but they carried an edgy plea wrapped in steel. She wasn't there to punish, but she wouldn't absolve without purpose either. Harriet nodded, her clasped hands tightening until her knuckles whitened. "I will," she whispered, her voice a tangle of gratitude and shame. It's hard, facing it all, but I'm learning. I owe that to you." Tears slipped free now, tracing silent paths down her weathered cheeks. She didn't wipe them away, as if letting them fall was part of the penance. For a moment, they sat in a stillness that felt almost sacred. The chasm between them forged by that single, fearful phone call didn't vanish, but it seemed to shrink, if only by inches. Jasmine took a sip of the sweet tea, the coolness grounding her, then set the glass down with a soft clink. "Take care, Harriet," she said, rising to her feet. She bent to give Tucker a quick pat, his weary fur warm under her palm, then turned for the door. It closed behind her with a gentle click, leaving Harriet alone in the dimming light of her kitchen. Harriet didn't move for a long while. The untouched glass of tea sat before her, a small puddle forming beneath it. Her tears fell faster now, hot and unrelenting, as the truth settled into her bones. She'd wielded her fear like a weapon, and it had cost her dearly, not just in the courtroom, where the verdict had stripped away her illusions of righteousness, but in the quiet of her own heart. Yet Jasmine's unexpected kindness, that final gesture of grace, flickered like a candle in the dark. It hurt to see herself as she truly was an instrument of hate. However unwitting, but it also sparked something new, a fragile hope. Harriet vowed then, with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed, to keep attending those classes, to step into the communities she'd once shunned. The price of her actions had been steep, a reckoning measured in sleepless nights and sidelong glances from neighbors. But she understood now that justice demanded such costs. True change, she realized, was a slow, bruising climb she'd only just begun. Outside, Jasmine strode down the driveway, her suitcase rattling behind her. A rideshare idled at the curb, its engine humming softly as she slid into the back seat. As the car pulled away, she exhaled a long, steady breath that carried the weight of closure. The city blurred past her window, a mosaic of brick and glass, and she let her thoughts drift. Life would march on, as it always did, but the strange twist of fate that had tethered her to Harriet Mansfield would linger in her memory. For Harriet, the lesson was a brutal one. Prejudice, even cloaked in the banality of a coffee shop complaint, could unravel a life in an instant. Its consequences were a mirror she could never unsee. For Jasmine, the ordeal sharpened her vigilance not just against distant threats she faced as an agent, but against the quiet, everyday injustices that bloomed in the spaces between people. A misplaced call, a fleeting glance, a moment of weakness, sometimes that's all it took to tip the scales. The car wound its way toward Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, the horizon swallowing the last of the day's light. Jasmine leaned her head against the window, feeling the cool glass against her skin. Justice, she mused, was a winding river slow to carve its path, relentless in its course. When it finally struck, its mark was indelible, a ripple that stretched far beyond the point of impact. Harriet had learned that lesson the hard way, her world upended by a single choice laced with fear. Jasmine, meanwhile, had shown a strength that defied the assumptions at the heart of their clash of grace, that didn't erase the pain, but reframed it, offering a chance at something better. In the end, the courtroom's gavel had delivered more than a verdict. It had cracked open a door to redemption for one woman and reaffirmed a mission for another. The fight against prejudice, Jasmine knew, was a thread woven into the fabric of her life's work, and she'd carry forward, step by steady step, wherever the road might lead.